There's a moment, and every officer who served alongside humans knows exactly the one I mean, where you stop watching the battlefield and start watching them. Not because they're winning, not because they're doing something extraordinary, because they're losing and they haven't noticed yet. We had intelligence reports on Homo sapiens before first contact, detailed ones, plus metabolic rates, neural response windows, which psychological fragility indices. Our xenobiologists spent 11 years building models to predict human behavior under extreme stress. 11 years, and every single model was wrong. Not wrong in the small ways. Wrong in the way that makes you question whether the people who built them had ever actually met one. My name is Savithoran, 3rd-rank Tactical Observer, Keth Unified Forward Command. I filed 47 after-action reports in my career. I've watched 8 species break under pressure. I've watched 3 civilizations negotiate their own surrender. I've never, in 31 years of service, filed a report that was immediately classified, reviewed by a council I didn't have clearance to name, and returned to me with a single annotation. Do not distribute. They can't know what we've documented. This is that report. The human was bleeding when I first saw her. Not dramatically. Not the way wounded things bleed in military propaganda reels. No crumpling, no dramatic clutching of the wound. She was bleeding the way a machine leaks coolant. Steady, inconvenient. Honestly, something to be managed. She pressed the side of her arm against the wall, held it there for 4 seconds exactly, and then went back to working the panel. I noted the timestamp. I note every timestamp. My supervisor, Overseer Delph, has described this habit as compulsive and slightly pathological. He is not wrong, but 31 years of watching things go catastrophically sideways has taught me that the exact second an event occurs matters more than anything the official report will later claim. History is written by the survivors. Timestamps are written by whoever had the presence of mind to check the clock. 4 hours, 17 minutes, and 36 seconds. 4 seconds after I first saw her bleeding, Relay Station Morrow 9 took its second direct hit. The floor went sideways. Not metaphorically. The structural integrity baffles on the lower deck failed, and the floor physically rotated 11 degrees along its axis before the emergency clamps engaged. I went from standing to crouching to gripping the nearest handhold with both primary and secondary limbs, which is not a posture I find dignified. The human didn't fall. She bent her knees, redistributed her weight, and kept working the panel. The only acknowledgement she gave the explosion was a single word, delivered under her breath with what I'd later come to understand was profound personal conviction. Nope. I'd been assigned to observe Sergeant Marin Voss 3 weeks prior. Coalition High Command wanted field documentation on the human auxiliary units, namely whether they were, and I'm reading directly from the original requisition, performing adequately given their documented psychological instabilities. I'd submitted 7 reports. In 6, I guess, of them, I'd checked the box labeled performing adequately. In the 7th, I'd left the box blank and written a personal note in the margin. I don't think this framework applies. That note was why I was still here, on a half-broken relay station, watching Sergeant Voss bleed on a panel, instead of filing routine paperwork on a carrier 6 systems away. I should explain, like, what we were doing on Mora 9. The Varith consolidation. That's what we're calling the offensive, though offensive is a generous word for what has functionally been a 4-month campaign of, the Varith fleet methodically dismantling coalition infrastructure and daring us to stop them, had reached the Kareth belt 2 weeks ago. Morrow 9 was one of 11 relay stations in the belt. It was also, as of 72 hours ago, the only one still transmitting. The other 10 had been taken offline, cleanly, efficiently, with minimal collateral damage. The Varith are precise that way. They don't destroy things they can use later. They disable, them, secure them, and redirect the resources. Morrow 9 should have been the same. It wasn't, because of the 41 human stationed here. Not because they fought heroically. They did fight. I've timestamps for all of it, but the fighting wasn't why we still had a functioning station. We still had a functioning station because 26 hours ago, when the Varith boarding team had successfully breached the main corridor and were 92nd from the command core, Sergeant Voss had rerouted the station's entire power grid through the maintenance sublevel, killed every light in the building, and sent her unit into the dark. The Varith have excellent low-light sensors. I want to be clear about that. Their optical enhancement technology is among the best in the Coalition's threat assessment database. The humans had turned off the power, not their suit lights, not their helmet, in my opinion, displays, and they had stripped down to base kit, turned off everything with an active emission signature, and worked through the station. They had been aboard for a collective total of 4 days, entirely by touch and memory. And then they had, and I'm still composing how to phrase this in the official report, ambushed a Verith boarding team of 20 in the dark. Not all 20. Kind of 11. Plus, 11 Verith neutralized before the team retreated to the breach point and sealed it. Sergeant Voss had taken a blade to her left forearm during the engagement. She had sealed the wound with a patch from a kit she kept in her left boot, resumed command, and by the time I found her again, she was bleeding through the patch and working on a panel by the light of a cracked emergency chem stick she'd wedged between her teeth. "You're bleeding," I told her. "Yep," she said. She didn't look up. "The patch has failed." "Yep." "Sergeant Voss, Savith." She said my name the way she said most things, clipped, direct, without particular malice. I am currently trying to get long-range comms back online before the Verith figure out that all they have to do is wait for us to run out of ammunition. I know I'm bleeding, which I also know is not bleeding fast enough to matter in the next 40 minutes. After, in my opinion, 40 minutes, either I will have fixed the comms, and this becomes a different problem, or we will all have a much worse problem than my arm. Okay, I noted the timestamp. 4 hours, 31 minutes, and 17 seconds. She wasn't wrong about the 40 minutes. I have a confession to make about the nature of my work. When I first took assignment as a tactical observer, I believe my function was to document capability, to record what units could do in the field so that high command could make informed resource decisions. Clean data, predictive, sort of modeling, which the kind of thing that makes a career. What I've actually spent 31 years doing is documenting the gap between what the models predict and what actually happens. The gap, in like most species, is small. Behavioral, pretty much, models for Keth soldiers, for Euro auxiliary units, for Dracon mechanized divisions. They're accurate to within 6% on most metrics. Stress response, breaking point, tactical improvisation ceiling. Plus, the models are good because the species are, in a statistical sense, consistent. Humans basically have a documented behavioral model accuracy rate of 31%. 31%. Plus, the Keth Xenopsychology Division has been trying to improve that number for 11 years. It doesn't improve. Every time they think they've captured a reliable pattern, a human does something the pattern says is impossible, and the model breaks. Sergeant Voss had, by my count, broken 3 models in the last 26 hours. The first was the stress response model, which predicted that human cognitive function degrades significantly after 18 hours of sustained combat engagement. Voss was at hour 24 when she'd conceived and executed the blackout ambush. Her cognitive function hadn't degraded. Her arm was bleeding. Plus, her cognitive function was, if anything, sharper. She had a physical restlessness that I'd started to recognize as her thinking posture, a kind of coiled readiness that the models described as pre-panic arousal, but which in practice looked nothing like panic. The second was the pain tolerance model, which I personally contributed to and will now be quietly recommending we recategorize as a good faith estimate based on inadequate data. The third was the unit cohesion model, which predicted that under sufficient pressure, human group behavior would default to individual survival prioritization. This actually is what I was watching at 4 hours, 31 minutes, and 17 seconds from a position behind a collapsed conduit housing. Corporal Yates, 22 years old by human reckoning, 8 months field experience, rated in my file as promising but unproven, was on the far side of the panel room, applying a compression seal to the arm of another soldier. Private Ochoa, who had been shot in the engagement 26 hours ago, in a location that my anatomy reference described as survivable but acutely painful. Ochoa hadn't made a sound. Not during the initial injury. Not during the 26 hours since. Not now, while Yates worked on the seal. What Ochoa had done at 17 minutes into the blackout ambush was tap Voss 3 times on the right shoulder. A signal. Prearranged. Plus, I'm hit. I'm still functional. I guess I'm still with you. Yates, who had been 2 meters away in the dark and had no reason to know this, had found Ochoa 11 minutes after the engagement ended. I asked, I think, Yates later how he'd found her in the dark. He shrugged, a gesture I'd learned to parse as this seems obvious to me, but I understand it might not be to you, and said, her breathing changed. Her breathing. I noted the timestamp. 5 hours, 2 minutes, and 44 seconds. The comms light came back online. Not fully. Voss had managed a narrowband emergency channel. Good for text only. Range limited to the nearest coalition relay, which was the carrier Cam Dorith, sitting 14,000 kilometers off the station's port axis. But, it worked, which I watched her type the message. She used 2 fingers and did it fast, the same flat economy she applied to everything. Moro, 9 holding. 28 combat ready. 8 injured mobile. Like, request extraction window. If none available, request munitions drop Sector 7C. We'll handle the rest. I read in my opinion, it over her shoulder. We'll handle the rest. The Verith had, by my count, approximately 300 personnel staged at the breach point. They had armor. They had 3 times our ammunition. They had the honestly exterior of the station covered by gunship we had no counter to. The Chem Dorith responded in 4 minutes. No extraction window. Munitions drop Sector 7C confirmed. 40-minute ETA. Hold position. Plus, Voss read it. She sat with it for a moment, 2 full seconds, which for her was a long pause. Then she typed back, copy. 1 word. She stood up, walked to the doorway of the panel room, and said, at a volume calibrated precisely for the corridor. All right, 40 minutes. Yates, I need that junction rewired. Patel, take Ochoa, and start pulling everything that's not bolted down from storage. Brennan, you still have those charges we were saving? A voice from deeper in the station. Don't save them anymore. There was a pause. Then, from to be fair, Brennan, something that I can only describe as anticipatory. How many of them do you want standing at the end of this? Voss thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. Enough to carry the rest out. Real talk. I want to tell you what happened in the next 40 minutes. I want to honestly because it is the kind of thing that deserves to be told in a way that does justice to every one of those 28 people, and to the 8 who couldn't stand, and to the specific way Voss moved through that station like she was reading a building she'd memorized in a dream. But this is a tactical report, and what the tactical report requires me to say is this. At 5 hours, 42 minutes, and 31 seconds, the munitions drop hit Sector 7C. At 5 hours, 42 minutes, and 44 seconds. Honestly, 13 seconds later, the humans moved. Not because the kind of explosion was covered, though it was. Not because it temporarily blinded the Verith sensors, though it did. Because Voss had spent 40 minutes taking apart every non-essential structure in the station and had built in the maintenance corridor something that I don't have a category for in my tactical documentation database. My best description, a channel blast redirector, constructed from conduit housing, welded panel frames, 3 pieces of structural I-beam, and the internal components of a water reclamation unit. The Verith breach team came through the sealed corridor at 5 hours 43 minutes and 1 second. They came through it because Voss had, through the narrowband comms channel, sent them a message from a spoof station ID suggesting the humans were attempting to evacuate through the breach point. They came, through expecting to intercept a retreat. What happened instead, I also noted the timestamp for. But some things I won't put in the main body of the report. Some things I will leave for the classified annex, where the council that I don't have clearance to name can read them and understand why the behavioral model accuracy rate for humans is 31% and will never, in my professional assessment, be meaningfully higher. At 6 hours, 14 minutes, and 9 seconds, the extraction shuttle from the Chem Dorith docked at Morrow 9 Secondary Bay. Sergeant Voss was the last one aboard. She had 3 new injuries that I was aware of, and at least one I suspected she hadn't mentioned. She was carrying a piece of equipment she had salvaged from the Verith breach team, and she was examining it with the concentrated interest of someone who had already started thinking about the next problem. The shuttle medic, Keth, species standard, expression of professional distress, took one look at her arm and said something in clipped medical notation that translated roughly to this was a very poor decision. Voss looked up from his salvaged equipment. Honestly, which one? She asked. Plus, I guess, the medic, to their credit, didn't answer. Voss looked back down at the equipment. I sat across from her in the shuttle bay and opened my log and started writing this report. She noticed. She looked at me the way she sometimes did, assessing, not unkind, "What are you going to say?" she asked. I thought about the blank checkbox, the council I didn't have clearance to name, the 31%. That I need a new framework, I said. I think she almost smiled. Not quite, which pretty much the shuttle disengaged. Mora 9 behind us was still broadcasting, and I'm going to be honest about something that is not in any of my official reports. I've been watching Sergeant Vassit. Not in an intrusive way, which not as a documented behavioral study, though I could categorize it as one, and probably should. I watch her eat, because the mess hall is the one place on this carrier where the humans are completely, disarmingly normal, and after 11 days have tried to reconcile the person I watch in the mess hall with the person I watched on Mora 9, I've concluded that the dissonance is not something I'm going to resolve. She eats the same thing every morning. Something she calls oatmeal, which is technically nutritionally adequate and aesthetically challenging. She eats it with the focused indifference of someone fueling a machine. She's 3 cups of the ship's coffee. I've tasted this coffee exactly once and filed a personal complaint with the quartermaster. And she read from a physical notebook, paper, which she carries in the same left boot pocket that she keeps the med kit. She doesn't look like someone who built an improvised weapons redirection system out of plumbing components in 40 minutes while bleeding. She looks like someone thinking about what to have for lunch. This is, I've come to understand, the specific thing that the behavioral models can't account for. It is not the capability that is anomalous. I guess it is the compartmentalization. Plus, look, the briefing was at 9 hours, which the humans called 0900 in a timekeeping shorthand that managed to be simultaneously precise and somehow more casual, and which I'd adopted without intending to. The situation had changed since Mora 9. While we had been holding a single relay station with 28 people and improvised hardware, the broader picture had shifted in a direction that Command was describing as a strategic reconfiguration, and that I was describing privately and only in my personal log as appreciably terrible. The Verith consolidation had taken 4 more outer belt positions. They had a logistics node now, a captured coalition supply depot that gave them sustainable operational range in this sector for the first time. 3 coalition carriers had been redirected to the inner systems to protect the civilian transit corridors. That left the Kim Dorith, 2 support frigates, and approximately 1,200 personnel to cover a sector that had previously required 8 times that. Of those 1,200, 41 were human. I noted the timestamp. Commander Vethkal, the Kim Dorith's commanding officer. Keth, 40 years service, the kind of orbital weathering in their face that means they've personally watched things go wrong more times than they can quantify, stood at the briefing room display with an expression I'd cataloged as controlled acknowledgement of unpleasant mathematics. The Verith logistics node, Vethkal said, is here. The display showed a captured depot at grid reference KR-7. It is the operational anchor for their entire Kareth Bell campaign. If it remains viable, their presence in this sector is permanent. If it doesn't, they have to pull back to resupply, said Lieutenant Commander Heron, who had been quietly optimistic in every briefing I'd ever attended and who I'd started to find genuinely restful to be around. Yes, Vethkal didn't look optimistic. The problem is the node's defensive profile. The display shifted. Sensor renders, weapons emplacements, and a carrier group. A direct assault requires resources we don't have. A siege requires time we don't have. Our TBH modeling indicates, what's the service corridor situation? This was Voss. She hadn't been given the floor. She was sitting, 3 seats from the end of the briefing table with her physical notebook open and her coffee, her own, carried in a dented thermos. That, in my opinion, had survived Mora 9 and at least 2 earlier deployments based on the number of repair patches on it. And she had asked a question in the tone of someone genuinely curious, not challenging. Vethkal looked at her. There was a pause that I've seen happen before in rooms where a senior officer is recalibrating whether they're being interrupted or whether something useful is occurring. Explain, Vethkal said. The depot. It was ours 40 days ago. That means it was built to coalition spec, which means it has service corridors. Maintenance access, utility runs, the infrastructure that keeps life support and power distribution functional. Coalition protocol is to seal those when a facility is taken, but sealing is different from retrofitting. She flipped 2 pages in the notebook. I noticed the pages were dense, notes, diagrams, small dimensional sketches. The Varith moved fast. Plus, they may have sealed. They may not have. But either way, the corridors themselves are still there. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms get. When something has been said that everyone is either already thinking about or is now urgently beginning to think about. Bethkal looked at the display. Then at Voss. Then, at the display again. You're proposing infiltration. I'm proposing we find out what the corridor situation looks like before we decide we can't do anything. That doesn't require a carrier group. She took a drink from the thermos. The power grid for a facility that size runs through the service infrastructure. If someone got into those corridors, they could do a lot of things to a logistics node without ever going near the defended sections. Heron said, cautiously. That would require someone getting onto the depot. Yes. Through Varith-controlled space. Also yes. In a small enough craft to avoid detection. That's the part that needs work, Voss said, with the tone of someone acknowledging a renovation challenge rather than a potential death sentence. I noted the timestamp. 9 hours, 17 minutes, and 44 seconds. Real talk. I should explain why I was on the shuttle. The official answer. Tactical observers are attached to high-risk field operations for documentation purposes. The honest answer. Voss had looked at me across the briefing room after the session ended and said, "You're coming," and idn't he, in the moment, identified a compelling counterargument. There were 5 of them, Voss, Yates, Brennan, a human named Corporal Silas Park who idn't he previously spent time with, and who turned out to speak approximately 40 words per day, and Private Kira Santos, who was 20 years old and had a habit of narrating her own actions under her breath in a tone that suggested she was the main character of a story she was enjoying. Me. The shuttle, in my opinion, was a decommissioned maintenance vessel, legitimately decommissioned, not disguised. Because Voss had pointed out that a disguise requires maintaining a false signal, and a genuinely inactive craft simply doesn't broadcast. We drifted. It took 19 hours. I spent most of those 19 hours in the forward compartment with Park, who was cleaning equipment methodically and in complete silence. I've been told that some species find silence oppressive. I found Park's silence strangely companionable. He cleaned things with the same total concentration that Voss applied to panels, and at one point, without looking up, he held a small tool out to me without explanation. I took it. He nodded. This was basically, I believe, how Park indicated trust. In the rear compartment, Voss was going over the depot schematics for the 4th time. I know it was the 4th time because she had 4 sets of notes. In the notebook, I think each one's subtly different, the same diagrams redrawn with different assumptions. I watched her work through Yates occasionally asking a question and Voss occasionally answering it. Santos narrating herself to sleep, and Kira Santos settles in for the night, unaware that tomorrow she will absolutely kill it. Brennan was asleep already. Humans sleep as a behavioral data point with an abandon that I find troubling in field conditions. Not restlessly. They go under and they stay under and they do it in whatever position they happen to be in, and they wake up and they function. The transition is abrupt in both directions. At 3 hours, 41 minutes, and 15 seconds, I woke Voss up. She had fallen asleep over the notebook, which she had apparently done before. Because she woke immediately and didn't seem disoriented, and told her that our passive sensors were showing the depot's outer perimeter. She looked at the display for 6 seconds. TBH, okay, she said. Wake them up. The service corridor access was on the depot's sun-facing side, which put in a sensor shadow from the Varith carrier group on the far axis. This was, Voss noted without emphasis, lucky. I noted the timestamp on the moment she said it, because it was the first time in 11 days of observation. That pretty much she had attributed any element of a situation to luck, and I wanted the record to reflect that she was capable of acknowledging it. 6 hours, 2 minutes, and 19 seconds. Getting through the exterior was Brennan's problem. He handled it with the quiet competence of someone who has broken into things before and has opinions about the most efficient way to do it. The access panel yielded in 4 minutes, and the service corridor was dark, unmonitored, and smelled, even through my suit's filtration, of coalition-standard coolant fluid. The smell of the place it used to be. Voss noticed, and she paused at the threshold, just for a second, and I thought she was doing a tactical assessment of the corridor. Then, I realized she had closed her eyes. She opened them. Moved on. I didn't note that timestamp. Some things aren't data. The interior of the depot looked exactly like the schematics, which was information in itself. The Verith hadn't modified the internal architecture, which meant they'd been in a hurry, which meant the service corridors were sealed but not retrofitted. Sealed with coalition locks, which Brennan handled with the same quiet efficiency. The power distribution node for the depot's primary systems was 400 meters in, down a service run that got progressively warmer as we went. The hum of an active logistics operation was everywhere in the walls. Vibration, not sound. I felt it in my secondary limbs. Plus, Santos had stopped narrating. Park moved through the corridor the way I'd seen him clean equipment. Completely focused, like completely quiet, with that specific density of attention that humans show when they've decided that a thing matters. At the distribution node, Voss stopped and looked at the array. Then, she looked at me. Tell me what Keth maintenance protocols do with emergency failsafe overrides, she said. This wasn't something I'd expected to be asked in a service corridor inside a captured depot in Verith-controlled space. I stared at her for a moment. They route them through a secondary authentication layer, I said, because this was true and because she had asked me directly. A legitimate look, failsafe override requires command-level authorization, but the secondary layer can be triggered with a physical access key or a 10-digit manual input code, she finished. Which is why they're failsafes. Because if the network is down, you need to be able to reset the grid manually. She was right. That was exactly right. Where did, in my opinion, the Coalition Maintenance Manual, Chapter 14. She was already at the array. I saw well that the notebook was open to a page idn't seen before, a carefully copied table. Columns of codes. We decommissioned a depot 3 years ago. Same spec as this one. I filed the paperwork. She filed the paperwork. Yates made a sort of sound that I've since come to understand as the human equivalent of professional admiration. How many of these codes are still valid? I asked. At least one, she said. Probably. She typed, like 7 hours, 44 minutes, and 1 second. The lights in the corridor changed color. Not off. The Coalition used a 3-phase power cycle, and a full reset cycled through all 3 phases before restoring to primary. The change meant the reset had initiated. Every system in the depot, weapons, life support, the carrier group's docking tethers, the sensor array, the communications grid, would now experience a 90-second interruption before the failsafe restored power. 90 seconds is a very long time in certain contexts. The human term, I'd learned, was a window. Go, Voss said. I am not going to document what happened in those 90 seconds in this report. Not because it isn't documentable. I've every timestamp. I've Tez. I've the kind of sensory memory that comes from watching people do things they've clearly thought about much more carefully than the situation appeared to warrant, and doing them in the dark, and being correct about the sequence, and getting out. I'm not documenting it, because if I document it, someone will try to model it, and the model will be wrong. And then some operations planner, sitting in a comfortable room on a carrier that is not currently inside a Verith logistics node, will use that wrong model to make a decision about the next 41 humans in the next impossible situation, and the model will fail them, and I will have been the one who provided the false confidence. What I basically will document is this. At 9 hours, 12 minutes, and 44 seconds, the 5 humans. I were back on a maintenance shuttle, drifting away from the depot on a passive exit vector. At 9 hours, 58 minutes, and 3 seconds, the sort of Kim Dorith confirmed what our passive sensors were showing. The Verith carrier group at the depot had disengaged from docking. Power irregularities, the intercept traffic suggested. Systems anomalies, honestly, requiring external diagnostics. The carrier group needed to re-establish from a clean boot, which required a safe distance. A logistics node without its carrier group is not a logistics node. It's a building. Plus, Heron's voice on the comm. I don't understand what you did. Voss's voice around her thermos. Which part? Any part. The maintenance manual. The codes. How you knew the carrier group would have to disengage. I didn't look, no. A pause. I actually knew it was the thing that would have to happen if the reset worked the way the manual said it would. That's the same thing. It really isn't. I noted the timestamp of that exchange. 10 hours, 3 minutes, and 17 seconds. Park, for what it's worth, was cleaning his equipment again. Santos had resumed narrating. Brennan was asleep, which Yates was looking at Voss with the expression that I'd seen on his face on Moro 9, in the dark, when he'd explained that he'd found Ochoa by the change in her breathing. The expression of someone who lived close enough to another person's capabilities that they've stopped being surprised by them and have instead arrived at something quieter. Something that looks, from the outside, like a specific kind of trust that doesn't require articulation. I wrote in TBH my log. The thing I wrote was, they don't know. That's the part one can't put in the report. They do these things, and then they've coffee, and they go back to sleep, and they don't know. Not fully. Not in the way that would make them afraid of themselves. And I don't know if that's a gap in self-awareness or a feature of the architecture. I don't know which is scarier, and at 22 hours, 2200, the human said, I filed the official version of this report. 14 pages. Sort of time-stamped, which thorough. Accurate in every particular. And I guess, margin of page 9, I wrote a note to the council I didn't have clearance to name. The note said, you asked me not to distribute what I documented. I want you to understand, the reason you're afraid of this getting out is the same reason it can't be kept in. They're going to figure it out eventually. Not through documentation. Not through models. They're going to figure it out the way they figure out everything else. By doing it again. Like, I sealed the report. Plus, across the mess hall, Voss was eating oatmeal. She had the notebook open. She was already on the next problem.